We're looking at complex PTSD and healing from it. So the idea is that the more psychoeducation we get, the less we suffer. And a lot of people with PTSD and C-PTSD, we end up at a point in our lives where we have a bit of a breakdown. So we'll go through many years after childhood trauma, from childhood, then getting on with our lives, a lot of disassociating, and then we will get to a point where the healing has to take place, but that generally only takes place when we have a chance to look at it. So the books that I've been reading from are The Tao of Fully Feeling, that's the first book. And tomorrow I'm going to read from here for people that have had, who've been dysfunctional parents. And this is not being unfair, this is just the reality of life, that many people who've had dysfunctional childhoods can then find themselves being dysfunctional parents through no fault of their own. So there's a chapter here that I'm going to work on tomorrow, or maybe Sunday, because tomorrow I'm going to explain about the flashbacks, the 4 Fs: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, response. So then I've got the next book that I read from is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And if anybody knows anybody out there who has anxiety, or they suffer from flashbacks or panic attacks, please do share this with them. And if you don't wish to comment on the live, then you can go over to my Facebook, or you can email me, and everything will be below the video when, you know, as I'm speaking, and there are reference points. So what I'm going to read, I printed this off from Pete Walker's webpage, and the webpage is below. So what we've got is, what is a trigger? So we're talking about triggers today and understanding the depth of what triggers are. So he explains, a trigger is an external or internal stimulus that activates us into an emotional flashback. This often occurs on a subliminal level outside the boundaries of normal consciousness. So flashbacks, when they happen, we don't realize what's going on. And for many people that have been through abuse, they don't realize that what a flashback is. It's only years later, when you've had psychoeducation, that you realize that you've suffered flashbacks, and you can put 2 and 2 together, and you go, oh my God, when I was behaving that way, or when I responded that way. Because flashbacks lead to the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And those responses can really run our lives. People have them as, we have them as a normal, you know, thing, but part of our biology as being human, we have the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. But what happens is that we will use 1 or 2 more regularly than others, or we'll be stuck in one or the other. So for instance, a fight response is where there's narcissism involved, and it means that there can be a lot of cruelty, and you want to fight with people the minute, you know, you go into a flashback. And the fight response, the flight response is when you get extremely busy and you disassociate, and you go, you know, you might behave like a pigeon, you know, like, I'm not saying you'd be a pigeon, but you're basically in a position where you're just like, your mind is on overload and you can't focus, and you get really busy. And some people do that with work and such. Then you've got the fight, flight, freeze, where you go into freeze. So some people won't leave the house, or they can't get things done, and they're in a, you know, very unfortunate position when that happens. And then you've got fawn, where you'll be extra nice to people, and you don't use your own authority to stand up for yourself, because that's what you were taught as a child. So now I'm going to continue saying here, what have we got? So continuing reading, he says, external triggers are people, places, things, events, facial expressions, styles of communication that remind us of our original abuse or abandonment in a way that launches us into reliving the painful feelings of those times. So it's a revisiting of your parents' or childhood home, seeing someone who resembles your childhood abuser, experiencing the anniversary of an especially traumatic event, or hearing someone use a parent's shaming turn or phrase. When trauma has been severe, or we are in an especially depleted state, resemblances can even be scant, perhaps all unknown. Men or authority figures trigger fear, or anyone noticing or looking at us triggers toxic shame. I was once intensely triggered by a squirrel. This makes me laugh. A squirrel staring at me. That's what he says. But I get that, where I've been myself, where you might be, you know, for instance, you might be sitting on a train, or you might be walking somebody somewhere, and somebody gives you an unkind look. I had a funny experience the other day, because I do study astrology as well, and somebody was walking towards me down a street where there was loads of room the other day, but they clearly wanted me to move out the way, and they gave me the dirtiest look that you could possibly imagine, because I was walking one way and they were walking the other way, but clearly they didn't want to move over. So, you know, that can be triggering for people that have been through abuse, because it can be there can be so many scary things that we experience, or the tone of somebody's voice, etc. So what I've got is, he says, internal triggers are usually initiated by the critic and involve thoughts and visualizations about endangerment or the need for perfection. Example, visualizing someone being abusive or worrying about not being perfect in executing some current or upcoming task. As recovery progresses, many survivors are shocked to discover that the majority of their flashbacks are triggered internally by the various internal programs of the inner critic. So what we need to do is to be able to get our inner critic under control. And underneath in the description section of this video, you're going to find 14 steps. There are 14 steps for managing your the inner critic, and 13 steps for managing flashbacks. So you can print those off, and they're very useful to have with you and get used to what they say, because once we get the inner critic under control, we begin to take control of our lives. So now I'm going to read where he says, how do I know I am in a flashback? So he says, we can often find ourselves in a flashback without ever having seen the flash. There are a variety of clues that we can learn to identify as signs that we are caught in a flashback. This is essential to recovery as naming our experience. Flashback, step 1 in flashback management, often immediately brings some relief, and more importantly, points us in the direction of working the other 12 steps of flashback management, listed on the flashback management page of this website. So the website's going to be below here as well. I'm just going to check that I am actually online, because I can't see. I can see one person, but nobody's saying hello. So I want to make sure I'm not talking to myself at the moment. Where's my page? I'm just checking via my mobile. My channel. And it says I'm live, but I can't see myself. Yes, I can. Right, okay, brilliant. Good, I can see myself on my mobile phone, which is good. So he then says that one common clue that we are in a flashback occurs when we notice that we feel small, helpless, hopeless, and so ashamed that we loathe to go out or show our face anywhere. So I went through a stage like that. When I had a breakdown in 2016, I did not want to deal with the world. I went inward. I didn't want to go out. I just wanted to be on my own. And I was on my own for a long period of time after an event that took place. I spent time as much as I could on my own. I'd only go out really when I had to get what I need. He says another common clue that we are flashing back is an increase in the virulence, I think that says, of the inner or outer critic. So the inner critic is where we annihilate ourselves, and we use the voice maybe of the parental role, or the parent who was abusing us verbally or looking at us in a particular way. The outer critic is when we take the experiences we've had and then we begin to project them onto others. So we may not trust people, we may be hypervigilant, and the outer critic can really basically slaughter people. But we do that with the inner critic as well. And these are things that we will unlearn as we get to understand as we get psychoeducated in these matters. And I would say that I myself have therapy, but it's not just therapy that's going to solve the issue. We have to bring in other things. It will be, maybe having therapy, verbally ventilating to friends that care about us or understand us, and having good people that get us and resonate with us. And then it will also be partly, our diet and getting rid of any things that are helping us disassociate, like any drugs or alcohol, which I did. I got rid of all of those things, and smoking cigarettes. And then you clean up your diet, and bit by bit, you'll get healthier and healthier. And I can attest to that. And it's a process to understand and sit with our emotions. He says here, another common clue that we are flashing back is an increase in the virulence of the inner or outer critic. This typically looks like increased drasticizing or catastrophizing, as well as excessive self-criticism or judgments of others. So a very common example of this is lapsing into extremely polarized all or none thinking. So many people do this in society. They'll say, you might have heard friends say, if you're late a couple of times, they say you always do that. Or you've heard family members, it's all or none. People are not giving you a break. They're, using the terminology as if you do something forever, which I pick people up on when they say that to me. If they say, you always do that, well, let's get to the truth of matters when we're dealing with each other. He also says, and most especially into only noticing what is wrong with yourself or others. So you can sort of focus on the negatives rather than looking at maybe the beauty in people. You might just see the ugliness in people. Rather seeing the good in people, you might just see the faults in people. And if we've been doing that with ourselves and we've had it done to us, it becomes something that we naturally then do, which we have to unlearn. He says here, on a personal level, I have learned over the years that when I am feeling especially critical of others, it usually means that I am feeling bad and have flashed back to being around my mother, who hated any dip in my mood or energy level, lest I be less useful and entertaining to her. During such flashbacks, then, I am self-protectively over-noticing others' faults, so I can justify avoiding them and the danger and shame of being seen in a state of not being shiny enough. See my articles on shrinking the inner critic. So on his webpage, he has shrinking the inner critic, but there's also a list where you can shrink your own inner critic. Inner critic work is really important, because if you began to watch all of the things that you say to yourself, when I started doing my inner critic work, and eventually I was telling my inner critic to bugger off and like pushing it out of the way in my mind, I wouldn't play with it anymore. I'd say, no, I stop it. Because it's so easy for us all to do. We're not this enough, we're not that enough, we're not qualified enough, we don't have, we're not pretty enough, we'll just go on and on and on. And that's taught behavior often. So then he says, shrinking the inner critic, for more info on how to recognize the various critic attacks that accompany as well as initiate flashbacks. So, next page. He says, another clue about flashbacks is seen in increased activation of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. And he says, see my article on trauma, and that's on his webpage too. And that will be below this video. Here are some examples of the many childhood trauma survivors learned early in life to manage and self-medicate the feelings of flashbacks and distracting activities and self-medicating substances. Flight and freeze responses, respectively. Over time, flight and freeze responses can become a habit. Flight types can devolve into distracting process addictions, and freeze types into tuning out with substance addictions. The former can morph into workaholism, busyholism, consumerism, or sex and love addiction, and the latter into drinking, drugging, TV entrancement, and compulsive eating, especially mood-altering junk foods that contain high qualities of salt, sugar, and fat. Addiction for many survivors is a matter of degree, and an especially strong urge to use more substance or process than normal is a powerful clue that one is in flashback. With practice, mindfully noticing a sudden upsurge in craving can be interpreted as the need to invoke the 13 steps of healthy flashback management. Now I'm going to give you an example. As I've healed and I've begun to clean up my diet, I decided, I had a UTI infection last month in May, and it wasn't clearing up. So what I did was, because I wanted to cure it naturally, I actually decided that I wasn't going to have any processed sugar for the whole month of June. And it's now the 22nd of June, And apart from honey, like half a teaspoon of honey in my tea, I have had no processed sugar this month. And I feel like I've got this energy that I've never had before. So it's showing me that as I've got healthier and had my psychoeducation, I'm really not, using anything. I've still got my Facebook thing where I think maybe one could say, I love using Facebook and social media, but again, I'm using it for purposes of helping people and interacting. And I enjoy that. But again, we can use all sorts of things as an addictive sort of process. But again, we're humans, so we have to, be kind to ourselves as well. We like what we like. But if it's harmful to us, then we have to look at it. He then says that addiction for many survivors is a matter of degree, and an especially strong urge to use more substance or process than normal is a powerful clue that one is in a flashback. So I found when I used to smoke and drink, when I was in flashback, I'd literally smoke one cigarette after the other. And, clearly for me, I'm not saying clearly, but when I stopped using those things, my flashbacks began to get more regular. And I didn't realize at the time what was going on. It was only when I found Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving in 2017, that I realized what the hell was going on with me. And through that, I went and got therapy, and now I'm beginning to blossom. So I know that it's possible that we can do that. He says, another clue that we are in flashback occurs when we notice that our emotional reactions are out of proportion to what triggered them. When a minor present time upset feels like an emergency, or when a minor unfairness feels like a travesty or justice. Example, a spilled glass of water triggers an increased diatribe of self-hate, or someone else's relatively harmless unsignaled lane change triggers us into rage. If we are not mindful at such times, we can either inappropriately act these feelings out against the relatively innocent other, or we can let them morph into shame and act them out onto ourselves in self-disgust or self-hatred. If, on the other hand, we mindfully recognize them as flashbacks to the way we felt about the real emergencies and injustices of parental abuse and abandonment, we can be empowered not only to invoke healthy flashback management techniques, but also to harvest the experience of an opportunity to validate the awfulness of our childhood plight. When we do the latter, we can assign and direct our anger into a self-protective protest about the unfair past, and our tears into self-compassionate crying for the plight of the child that we were. Finally, it cannot be stressed enough that it takes a great deal of practicing both of these responses to heal the developmental, changing page, arrest of being blocked from our all-important instincts of self-protection and self-compassion. So until we get to a level of healthy anger and healthy blame, we're not going to have the tools to be able to get rid of the inner critic as well. So it's part of it. We get rid of the inner critic. We allow healthy anger and healthy blame. An example would be the Catholic Church of late. If, so the many that have been through sexual abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church, as an example, if they're not allowed to verbally ventilate that and they're told to forgive the priests and, because it's to do with God or whatever, all of the stories that humanity says to authorities, say to people, for instance, then if people are filled with toxic shame because they're blaming, and then it means that they're not going to be able to get angry, healthy anger, and they're not going to be able to get rid of their toxic shame or guilt, because many abuse victims, whether it's verbal, sexual or physical, feel guilty. Children feel guilty, and we carry that into adulthood because we think that we did something that made people behave that way. And clearly adults do have control over themselves, and in abuse there's either, people are just not, parents are either not conscious, or they're going through their own stresses and they're not managing their own lives very well, or that in cases of sexual abuse and paedophilia, then it's very manipulative. People know what they want to do, and they behave in ways that are manipulative and narcissistic, and it's cruel. It's in my view, it's what I would call soul rape, because the deep, you know, the depth of being human, and what, you know, sex actually is. It's supposed to be a loving thing between two people, and to take it to a level where children are being used in that way, and violence as well. I mean, I think we know, you know, me saying this, we all know what the truth is here. So then he says, why does it take so long to actually get that you're recovering from C-PTSD? He says, because of the all or none thinking that typically accompanies complex PTSD, survivors in the early stages of recovery often fail to notice or validate their own actual progress. Inner critic thought processes discount signs of progress whenever a new flashback occurs. No matter how much less intense it is than before, every reoccurrence of feeling of shame, fear, of depression is interpreted as proof that nothing's changed, and when there are increasing periods of being over-activated. So for myself, you know, I've seen myself do that, where I've gone into a flashback and I phoned up a friend and I said, I really need to speak to you right now. I'm in a flashback. It happened today, actually, for a minute. There was an incident that put me in a flashback. The flashback didn't last very long. I was able to objectify really quickly, but I did need somebody to speak to at the point that this event happened, because it was not very nice what happened. But what happened, I was able to stand up for myself really quickly. So I've seen my great progress and in my own looking after myself and my own psychoeducation. So he goes on to say, every reoccurrence of feeling shame, fear, of depression is interpreted as proof that nothing has changed, even when there are increasing periods of not being overactivated. The critic's black and white assessment is either I am cured or I am still hopelessly defective. And once we identify with the critic's pronouncement of defectiveness, we are off spiraling downward into a full-fledged flashback and captured once again in the ice veneer of toxic shame that freezes us helplessly and hopelessly in our pain. So prior to, you know, events where I've had flashbacks before, I used to be so apologetic. As I was speaking to a friend, I was saying, I'm sorry I'm like this, I'm sorry that I'm, you know, upset, and apologizing for the fact that I was in a flashback. So, you know, and then it's toxic shame when you get off the phone because you think I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have called my friend. So we need to have open honesty with the people that are our friends, so they understand what's going on and they can support us. And we can also support our friends equally with their life issues. You know, we can do these things equally. It says, he goes on to say, it is exceedingly difficult to accept the proposition, the fact that recovery is never complete. And although we can expect our flashbacks to markedly decrease over time, how hard it is to let go of the salvation fantasy that we will one day be forever free of them. And I'll give you an example. Like, you know, you could be going through life, done so much healing, like you could have gone years and years of healing, and then you get something on the news that is tragic, you know, like, you know, like the Catholic Church. I'm not getting at the Catholic Church in particular, but I'm using an example. Like if you see that in the news, or you see a case where children have been so badly violated. I think there was a case where children somewhere in America, 13 of them were all chained to their beds for years, and in a house, in a street, which was, you know, in a built up area, so to speak, and nobody knew, like nobody knew what was going on behind closed doors. So we can see that when we see those cases on the news, if we've had violations ourselves, it's going to take us back, and we will have a flashback, we will have memories, and we will maybe feel anger and stuff like that. He goes on to say, so we need to get rid of the salvation fantasy and know that we're human. So it's like some days people who've not been through abuse, they have good days, they have bad days. You know, but they like their job, they don't like their job. You know, they break up with somebody, they feel hurt, they have tears. So we need to get rid of the toxic shame by thinking that we've got to be completely cured and that's when we'll be okay. It doesn't work that way. Next, he says, yet if we do not disidentify from this expectation of salvation fantasy, we will remain extremely susceptible to blaming and shaming ourselves every time we have a flashback. Understanding and accepting this is so crucial because recovery typically progresses in a process that is 2 steps forward and 1 step back, with the unfortunate subjective experience that at times that 1 step backwards, feels like all the world like 6, like it means it can feel like 6 steps backwards, but it isn't. This is especially true because of the interminability feelings of flashbacks, the recreation of the feelings being the state of the child who had no capacity or resources to imagine a future that would be significantly different than the seemingly everlasting present of being so abandoned. So we know that, you know, if anybody recalls, to be that abandoned as a child, you know, when you're in it, you don't really understand it as a child, and you can have depression and abandonment depression and loneliness, and, you know, you've got no one to speak to. But as you grow up as an adult, you can get really peed off that you were so violated. So it's healthy to have healthy anger and to fully remember the incidents so that they can be fully grieved. I'm going to continue reading. He says, so how can we come to bear the knowledge that our awful childhoods have created some permanent damage, that we have a condition, Daisy, I haven't lost myself, that we have a condition that is somewhat analogous to diabetes, a condition that will need management throughout our lives. It is a piece of bad news that is tremendously unpalatable, but the good news, as with diabetes, is that as we become more skilled at flashback management, fully rich and rewarding lives become increasingly possible. Even better is the news that complex PTSD, when effectively managed, eventually bestows some gifts and silver linings unavailable to those less traumatized. And I can absolutely tell you that, you know, where I'm at now, getting on social media, speaking truth, helping other people, you know, there's been a silver lining for me. It's like I've stepped into myself. I no longer have toxic shame. I say what I think. I've still got work to do on myself, but, you know, there's huge improvement. He says here, he says, fully rich and rewarding lives become increasingly possible. Even better is the news that complex PTSD, I've already read this bit, when efficiently managed, eventually bestows some gifts and silver linings unavailable to those less traumatized. We live in an emotionally and relationally impoverished culture, and those who work deeply on their wounds are often rewarded with emotional intelligence far beyond the norm, and a capacity for intimacy that is rarely seen in the general populace. This multi-dimensional intimacy is that which comes when two people mutually communicate about all aspects of their experience, the happy and the sad, the loving and the angry, the enthused and the disappointed, and are thus able to be in authentic supportive connection of all states of being human. So I found that really, once I started speaking up, it's made me more compassionate for people. And then I found out that you know, there are so many people through groups and whatever that have had similar, worse or like experiences, but all childhood trauma, that cruelty is cruelty. You can't measure one against the other. In reality, a child is a child. So we're all, it's possible to heal. That's that much I do now. I'm going to continue reading. If you've got any questions, do feel free to, you know, I'm here, or you can come over to my Facebook page. I've got a ladies group for ladies for anxiety and complex PTSD. And also I've got my email below if you've got any questions, anybody watching. So he says, healing from PTSD is also a long, gradual process because recovering our developmentally arrested instincts of full self-expression requires practicing new championing behaviors that trigger flashbacks to times when we were punished or abandoned for acting in our own self-interest. Self-championing was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. So for instance, you know, if a parent was beating you with a belt or slapping you and you said, leave me alone, you know, you wouldn't be able to, they'd do it harder or something. Or, you know, people who've been through sexual abuse, they're groomed at very young ages to not say anything. The abuser will, you know, speak to that child and tell that child. The general story is, which is quite amazing that they do this, and what they do is, paedophiles generally, they will say to a child, you can't tell anyone, because if you tell anyone, you'll be taken away and I'll be sent to prison. Or they'll give the child some story that will keep them quiet. There are many ways that this happens, but that's often one of the things that was used, and that was one of the things that was used that I experienced as a 4-year-old, you know, or younger. So he says here, self-championing was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. He says the flashback pain that this kind of practicing triggers can feel so acute that it masks the general gradual relief and reduction of the chronic pain of remaining invisible. The pain of flashbacks induced by practicing self-expressive behavior that was punishable in the childhood family is a bit like going to the dentist for a toothache. Unless we accept the acute pain of the dentist's therapeutic procedure, we will suffer chronic dental discomfort indefinitely. So when we're working on ourselves, we might find it scary, but the reality is, I know people have picked up this book in groups and they say, oh, I'm too scared to pick it up and read it. I fully encourage you. And if you need support, and, you know, there are the complex PTSD books from Surviving to Thrive. And if you get that book, I think it's free on Audible USA, not Audible, Amazon Audible USA, and it's free currently on Kindle in the UK. So you can get this book for free currently on from those two sources. And if you start reading this book and you're finding it difficult, take it slowly, and then, you know, join the ladies group if you're a lady, or if you're a guy, then I'll put out, you know, you can ask me what groups I know where there are joint groups that you can join. So he says, recovering from overwhelmingly painful childhoods is hard because we can't help wanting to avoid any kind of pain at all, whether it is the normal existential growing pains of learning new, difficult things, or the flashbacks inducing pain of choosing to cultivate the developmentally delayed instincts of self-compassion and self-protection. These quests sometimes become more embraceable to me when I remember the poet's words, he's not busy being born, is busy, he who is not busy being born is busy dying. And as black and white as this aphorism might strike those of you who have significantly shrunk your critic, some of the latest research in neuroscience, this is good news, suggests that we actually need a modicum of stress in our lives, which is now called optimal stress. The stress is the balanced, moderate amount of stress that appears to be necessary to grow the new neurons and neuronal connections that correlate with keeping the brain healthy. Research shows, I'll give you an example, you know, if it's stressful when you're trying to like figure something out, like technology or stuff like that, that little bit of stress that pushes us like to try and figure something out. Could be, that's just one example. There are many, I'm sure. Research shows that just as too much stress creates a biochemical condition that kills neurons in the brain, too little leads to death and lack of replacement of old neurons. This is why lifelong learning is widely recognized as one of the key practices necessary to avoid Alzheimer's disease. So what I'd say is, I mean, I read some great books. I'm reading Carl Jung at the moment. I watch a lot of YouTube videos that are to do with psychoanalysis. So and I love astrology. I read astrology charts. So I'm always looking at what's happening with the planets and what the aspects mean, and all of that learning means that my brain is, you know, growing. It just doesn't stop, particularly in astrology. You just, you know, there's just so much to know that, and everybody's chart's different. So that's an example that, you know, I found something I love to do that helps other people and makes sense to me. It's a tool to objectify our lives. And, you know, if you find something that you enjoy, instead of just sitting, you know, if you sitting in front of a television or, you know, smoking weed or drinking a bottle of wine, find something that you're drawn to, that brings you out of yourself, that begins to serve not only you, but others as well. So I'm going to actually continue reading this little bit here because there's only 2 pages. I've done well on this. So he says, what are the signs that I'm recovering? So this is good stuff to know. He says, effective recovery work leads to an ongoing gradual reduction of emotional flashbacks. Over time, we become more and more proficient at managing them and alleviating unnecessary states of activation. This in turn results in flashbacks occurring less often. And again, I can attest to that. I don't have flashbacks nowhere near like I used to. I used to have flashbacks like, daily, hourly, like now I can go through a whole day without one, which is just a miracle, but that's because I've had therapy and psychoeducation. So then he says that over time, we become more and more proficient at managing them and alleviating unnecessary states of activation. And this in turn results in flashbacks occurring less often, less enduringly, and less intensely. Also, I can get them and they'll last like for 10 minutes, whereas sometimes I've had them and they'll last like, 6 hours, 8 hours, like, and then you go to bed with them and then you can't sleep. So it's brilliant, doing this work. It's so brilliant. I mean, I thank God for Pete Walker in this book, saved me. Another key sign of recovering is that the critic begins to shrink. That inner critic begins to shrink, and it loses its dominance on the psyche. As it shrinks, the unfriendly ego now has room to grow. The user-friendly ego. So people bash the ego. The ego is great because the ego allows you to make choices, and it allows you to objectify, and it allows you to cross the road, and it allows you to decide what flavor ice cream you want, if you want ice cream. So the ego has got a lot of bad bashing around in spirituality. We need an ego. And a healthy ego is brilliant. Yeah. So going on, as it shrinks, the user-friendly ego has room to grow and develop the kind of mindfulness that more readily recognizes when the critic has taken over. So then you see that inner critic going, what's wrong with you, or you're ugly, or whatever it's saying to you. You begin to just say, out of my way, like you would do to a human being who's talking to you like that, hopefully. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't put up with any nonsense unless it's, there's a difference with where people are giving you advice, or that you're sharing together and you're healing something, and it's what's the word, positive, a positive event, looking at our behavior and seeing how we can improve it. Then he says, so the more recognizes when the critic has taken over, which in turn allows us to be more readily disidentify, form, or fight against its perfectionism and drasticizing processes. Another sign of recovering occurs as a gradual increase in our ability to relax. So what I found is I relax more and I breathe, much easier. And this is good for the organs in the body as well, because all of that stress and cortisol is really no good for the body. The adrenals get overworked. So he says to resist overreacting from a triggered position, i.e., example, from an inappropriate fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And he says, see my article. Again, you'll see it in his webpage. Moreover, there is an increase in our ability to use our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn instincts in a healthy, non-self-destructive ways. So there is a healthy fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. It's not, it's not one way, but there's unhealthy fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So he says the instincts in healthy, non-self-destructive ways, so that we only fight back when we are under real attack, only flee when odds are insurmountable, only freeze when we need to go into an observer acute mode, only fawn when it's appropriate to be self-sacrificing. So fawn in the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, it's like somebody's, being narcissistic, really horrible to you, and then you're being very pleasing and nice to them. So they, so that, that they're not horrible to you. Well, at what point as adults, we're going to say, hey, I don't like being treated that way, and you're not being nice to me, so I'm going to remove myself from this situation. This is how a lot of codependent relationships pan out. A lot of people get into codependency, and sort of narcissistic relationships and stay in them because they, it's the inability to, stand up for ourselves. So we get healthier and healthier in our choices because we get more mindful. Then, if I lost my place and go into acute observer mode. So then he says, another way of describing this is that we have good balance between the polar opposites of fight and flight. We can facilitate healthily between asserting our own needs and compromisingly acquiescing to the needs of others. And moreover, we can balance the polar opposites of fight, flight, freeze, which is their moderate manifestations look like a balance between doing and being, between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system arousal, between left and right brain processing. Advanced recovery correlates with letting go of the salvation fantasy that we will never have another flashback. So I will say this, we don't know when we're going to be shocked. Anything could happen in the world that could shock us at any time. So if we're going to say, I'm never going to be upset again, or I'm never, like I've stopped eating sugar for this month of June. If I say I'm never going to eat sugar again, I mean, I'm human. I've done something for myself that I'm enjoying. I wanted to see what it felt like, but we have to, have healthy balance between what we're doing and what's right for us. So I'll say this again. Advanced recovery correlates with letting go of the salvation fantasy that we will never have another flashback, and moving into an attitude of accepting the inevitability of a modicum of flashbacks. This attitude then allows us to easily recognize and quickly respond to them from a position of self-compassion, self-soothing, and self-protection. So anybody watching out there at the end of this, I've been on for a while. I'm going to show you this book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker, #1. That's the book that turned my life around and brought me out here to speak to people and lose my toxic shame and begin to love myself at a very deep level, even when I'm having a bad day. And The Tao of Fully Feeling, that's an older book of his, but again, it's very useful to read, and I suggest both of them highly. And in fact, I think that's it for today. So anybody out there, I've got the ladies group over on Facebook, Anxiety and PTSD. And I think that I'll be back tomorrow. I'm going to be going through the 4 Fs, which are the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. It's going to be probably take about 40 minutes, but it's going to go through the different types and how we can alleviate those, and also the 13 steps for managing flashbacks. And I made a slideshow, but you'll see me. It's not just going to be the slides. And then there'll be Q&A if anybody wants to ask questions as I'm reading through them, then we'll be able to do that too. So thank you for watching. I can see 3 are watching, and I don't know when on these, you don't see who's watching. You just see the number come up of who, how many people. So please share this, and if you've not seen me before, then maybe you could hit the notification button so you get my updates, or subscribe. I would really appreciate that, and to share it out with people that may need to hear this information to begin to heal their own childhood trauma or adult trauma where complex PTSD has, become part of their own psyche and makeup due to long-term abuse. Thanks for watching. I'm going to sign out now. Okay, thank you. Back tomorrow.